Okay, so thank you very much indeed, Julian, for having accepted this invitation. I'm really pleased to talk to you, to meet you. And I start with an introductory note about you. You can also correct me if there is something missing or wrong, and then we will move on to the questions. So Julian Baggini is a philosopher, journalist, and the author of over 20 books about philosophy, written specifically for a general audience. He's co-founder of the interesting magazine, The Philosopher's Magazine, and it's written for numerous international newspapers and magazines. Among his books are The Ego Trick, What Does It Mean to Be You? Without God, Is Everything Permitted? Freedom Regained, The Possibilities of Free Will, The Age of Reason, A Rational Skeptic in an Irrational World, A Short History of Truth, How the World Thinks, A Global History of Philosophy, and I think you also have A Short History of Truth, right?
That's right, yeah.
Right. And the book that I have here, the Godless Gospel, that we're going to focus on today, the interesting, beautiful book that I had a chance to read. My first question, Julian, is, does Jesus offer a moral system, or he's a revolutionary who at most adds or supplements something to morality?
Okay, well, before I answer that question, let me just sort of fill in a bit of background about how I approach it. So I don't approach this as a kind of a historical Jesus scholar, okay? And there are such things, although I think I have a very hard time, because actually there's very, very little historical information about Jesus. And most historians who are being objective will just acknowledge that. So my purpose in thinking about the Jesus for me is the character of the Gospels, and how historically accurate that is or not, we have no idea. I think most of us would assume it's not extremely historically accurate, but that's the character. And what I'm trying to do in the book, The Godless Gospel, is that it's become a kind of commonplace for people who are not religious, because in countries like mine, England, Britain, and across Europe, increasingly people do not identify as religious, and Christians are a minority in the UK now. But people have a sort of attachment to Jesus, and they're familiar with a lot of the teachings. And a lot of people will say that Jesus, okay, they don't believe he's the Son of God, or they don't believe, as Muslims do, that he's a prophet sent by God, but they do believe he's an important moral teacher. And the purpose of the book is to take that suggestion seriously and ask, well, is he really an important, interesting moral thinker? So I'm talking about Jesus as the character in the Gospels, and I am totally agnostic about the historical Jesus. Now, in answer to your question, does he offer a moral system? I think the answer to that is no. And interestingly, that's not controversial, because I in writing the book, I wanted to talk to people who had more of a commitment to Jesus's teachings. They were sort of Christians or very heavily Christian influenced scholars. So I spoke to a lot of them, and they pretty much agreed with that, actually, that they thought that wasn't the purpose of the teachings, that Jesus's teachings are against the background of the Jewish law, which he on many occasions said he accepted. But he was there to kind of shake things up a bit, question a few things, and move things on. The way he's presented in the Gospels, he thinks he's fulfilling the Jewish law. He's making it more complete. He's not subtracting from it or altering it. But I think understood in that way, so not as offering a system, but as offering certain challenges, if you like, I do think he's an interesting moral thinker, at least.
I think you already answered my second question again, but I repeat the question though. I mean, it's like the Philosopher's Magazine, like the magazine I noticed in the beginning of this interview, is an independent quarterly publication aimed at making philosophy accessible to a wider audience. Can I say that your attempt in this book was to get the message in the Bible across to a wider audience?
Well, I'm not sure, because it's not that I entirely agree with what that message is. I mean, I'm not a Christian myself, and although I think Jesus actually is an interesting teacher, for me, he isn't at the top of the list. And interestingly enough, again, some of the Christians I spoke to said that purely as a moral philosopher, if you like, some of them thought that there are other people who would be higher on the list, like Aristotle or Confucius. So it's not really to sort of get out the teaching, but it's to get people to take some of Jesus's challenges a bit more seriously. And I think there are some reasons for doing that, because in his time, Jesus, as presented in the Gospels, was very much a kind of he was a challenge. He was a countercultural figure. And I think he still potentially has that function today. And I think it always helps us with our moral thinking to be challenged, to hear points of view which make us think, well, hang on, maybe what we take for granted and what we assume is the best way to do things, maybe that's not perfect, to say the least.
Right. Julian, one of the parts of, let's say, integral part of not only the Bible, a lot of old books, not only holy books, is parables. How did you deal with the fact that there are a lot of parables in the Bible?
Yeah. Well, I think that's, again, I think that's a very interesting point. And but what I found quite interesting to think about this was that it's not so far away from the style of contemporary moral philosophy in the English-speaking world. We don't use the term parables, but actually a lot of moral arguments base themselves around a story. And the point of the story is to try and get the reader to see something which is the morally significant aspect of the story, and to draw some kind of general conclusion. So if I give an example, perhaps one of the most famous of the last sort of 50 years was one offered by Peter Singer. And you could imagine this being told by Jesus. Let's try and do it in the style of Jesus. One day a man was walking by a pond, and he was walking towards a meeting of some very important people. And in the pond that he was walking past, he saw a child was crying for help. The child was drowning in the water. The man knew that he could swim, but he also knew that this lake was not very deep, and that he could wade in and he could take out the child. And if he did so, he would spoil his fine clothes, which he had worn for this occasion, and he would be late for the meeting with these important people. Do you think this man should save the child or go to his meeting, right? That's not exactly the way Peter Singer tells it, but it's more or less. So it's like a parable, really. How does the reader respond to that? The reader says, well, of course, if you're a decent human being, of course you go in and you take the child out. You would be a monster not to. Now, the point is, in Jesus's parables, he doesn't go that extra step a lot of the time and spell out the meaning explicitly for you. So it's often left to the reader to sort of spell out the moral of the story, if you like, for themselves. So like with the Good Samaritan story, which is a similar story in a way, the reader draws the conclusion themselves that to be a good neighbor means to help people in need, even if they are not of your tribe, even if they're not of your group. So Jesus doesn't need to say that. It's kind of obvious. In contemporary philosophy, people do draw out the conclusion very much because they want to establish it as a general principle, and they will probably also have other arguments to supplement it with. But so the general moral of that story is that if you can save a life at a cost to yourself, which is trivial in comparison, then you ought to do it. And Peter Singer's challenge is, well, if that's true, if you accept that principle, then isn't it also the case that, instead of spending money on takeaway coffees, which cost in about £3 each in the UK, when each one of the £3 could actually make a big difference to somebody in an emergency, your inconvenience of not having your coffee is less than the inconvenience of the man going into the pond, spoiling his clothes and being late. It's trivial. So you shouldn't do it. You should spend that money on helping people instead. So he has that strong challenge. So the parables are really, if you looked at it in that way, the use of parables to get us to draw out moral lessons is something that we continue to do. The difference is we don't call them parables, and in the analytic style of philosophy, we draw out the conclusions more explicitly. Jesus leaves it for you to work out. And in a way, that's good. And this is also has a certain similarity, I think, with some of the Confucian stories you get as well. Because there's this long tradition of thinking that moral education is not about, learning facts, and it's not even about mastering arguments. Moral education is about developing certain sensitivities and habits. And the way to do that is to sort of, is practice. So getting people to draw the conclusions out themselves rather than spelling them out is sort of part of what makes the moral education more powerful. So I think that is quite interesting.
I will get back to this point later. I have a question specifically about that point, but now that we are here, like in the beginning of the book, you have this interesting concept that you address, that's metanoia, I think, and you emphasize that's a very integral part of the teachings of Jesus. Could you please tell us a bit about it?
Oh God, I get my Greek words. I wrote the book many years ago. So metanoia, right? Is
right.
I can't even. I'm trying to come up with like I don't have the nice definition on the tip of my tongue. How did you understand it? It's
I mean, like
emptying
transforming
self,
exactly, because you were talking about the skills, right? Yeah, I mean, you were talking about the fact that what actually they're highlighting in their morality, or in his morality here, is the skill, the ability, like what you also see in the Stoics, the ability to change yourself, to become a better person, rather than knowing all these things without applying them to your life.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I mean, it relates to this idea. I mean, in kenosis, which is a very central idea in Orthodox religion, which is the self-emptying. That's the emptying of the self. So you're supposed to kind of, which has a lot of parallels with certain ideas in Buddhism, for example, again, which is that you have to kind of, in some sense, acknowledge the emptiness of yourself to open yourself up to the higher in some way. But the more general idea is about self-transformation. That's the goal, right? So self-transformation is the important thing. And I think the reason that's quite challenging and a bit countercultural is that, and the reason why I wouldn't entirely agree with it as well, is that it places all the focus on you. It's the individual. So you have to transform yourself. That is your task. That is your spiritual and moral task. And that means the task isn't really to change society, right? And I think this is interesting, and people will disagree with this and they'll challenge it, because I think these days, Jesus is often presented as the friend of the poor, the friend of the sick, and all of this. And he talks about, if you've got 2 coats, give to the person who has 1. And so there are various things in Jesus's teachings which make people like to think that Jesus was, if not a kind of early socialist, but, interested in radical social reform and a more equal society. Now, I think if you actually read what he says in the Gospels carefully, that's just not credible, right? He every time he is given the opportunity to say he wants to sort of challenge the political rule, all that kind of stuff, he turns away from it. He doesn't want to do it. He says, no, that's not what it's about. All the things he gets people to do are to do with the transformation of themselves. Even those charitable acts, really, I mean, I would argue they're primarily about the purification of yourself rather than the help of others, right? So the point about, there's that very famous saying, which is, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And people say this is a very odd expression, but the most credible interpretation of that is the eye of the needle was a gate, I think, in Jerusalem, and it was very narrow. In order for a camel to pass through it, they would have to take off all the things that it was carrying, right? So the idea here is that, and this, even if that's not the exact correct interpretation of that passage, other things Jesus says, I think, suggest this is the message. In order to sort of purify yourself to become the better person, you have to shed your attachment to material goods and wealth and all these shallow things. And that's the main reason why you get rid of them, right? I mean, sure, in doing so, you can also help people who have nothing, and that's good. But it's really not that's not really the primary aim. I mean, again, going back to Peter Singer would say, if your primary aim was to help the poor, then actually you should earn a lot of money and then give it away, right? That's what you should do if that's your primary goal. Jesus doesn't advocate that at all. Of course he doesn't. He advocates just simply not acquiring wealth in the first place. So you're not going to be in a very good position to help the poor if you follow Jesus's advice. In fact, you're going to become poor yourself. But that's fine, because being poor in money enables you to be rich in spirit in some way. So that's a very countercultural message, I think, because we like to think that, you know, social justice is always about transforming society and making people materially better off. Jesus says you don't really want to make people materially better off. Of course, you want to eradicate extreme poverty and suffering. You don't want people to get richer and richer. That would actually be bad for them. But the other reason I just think the general idea of self-transformation is quite countercultural is that, you know, we live in a society where we are, well, I say we live in a society, the world is different, right? I'm in Iran, where you come from, this probably isn't the case as much, and there are many parts of the world where it isn't. But in the sort of, you know, the part of the world that I'm in and most connected to and speak to, there is a big culture of, you know, self-improvement. But self-improvement really means making yourself fitter, stronger, healthier, smarter, you know, a better lover, all these things, right? It's never about moral self-improvement. Yeah, isn't it? I mean, when was the last big self-help book about, you know, how to become a better person, right? I mean, whenever kindness is kind of advocated, it's always because that's the way to make yourself happy, right? So they'll say, you know, be grateful, be kind, because that's the key to happiness, not because it's your duty or responsibility. So I think the idea that our main focus is to make ourselves better people morally is just a very interesting sort of challenge in itself, even if we don't think Jesus's idea of how we do that is the best one.
Right, I agree. I mean, definitely you're right, especially from this perspective that we are in Europe or in Britain. But like, I mean, I remember once I was in Iran. I was a teenager, not teenager. I was like in my 20s. One of the pictures of Jesus that really impressed me was like Pasolini's film, where he was like fighting the Pharisees, and like as a social justice figure, he really impressed me. And even today, there are writers like Terry Eagleton who also try to sort of reconcile this Marxism with this Christianity, and you believe that it is not really the way.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think it is. I mean, you know, you just go and read the Gospels. This is one of the points. And one of the things about the book is that if you want to read the Gospels, but you don't believe, you're not a religious believer, then obviously you believe that all the stories of the miracles and resurrection and prophecies, this is all just not true and not very interesting. Some of it you could interpret as kind of metaphor, but whatever. So what I did, and which other people have done before, Jefferson did it and Tolstoy did it in different ways, was to take out all the things which would be problematic for a non-believer and just be left with the teachings. So this is the Godless Gospel. So as well as my writing on the book, there is kind of about a third of the book is the Godless Gospel, the four Gospels combined together with the supernatural bits taken out. Now, if you look at those, and to be honest, if you did keep the supernatural things in, you certainly wouldn't get anything which is advocating a kind of a Marxism. If you just read it, I'd say just read that and see if you can honestly say this Jesus is a figure who is campaigning for the redistribution, the state redistribution of wealth. He's in favor of people, the wealthy, getting rid of their wealth. That's entirely voluntary, right? I mean, this fits a kind of American Republican sort of model, right? I mean, obviously people don't do it enough, but a sort of Christian libertarian American view is that the government should leave you alone. It's not the government's job to feed the poor, but as an individual, you should give a lot of money away. And Americans do donate, I think, on average, more of their income to charities than Europeans do, because Europeans expect the state to do more and Americans don't. So Americans feel more of a personal responsibility to do that. It's much more in keeping with that ethos than it is with an idea of it's the state's job to do this. So I mean, it's just not there. I think it's just not there. And I think it's quite interesting that people convince themselves that it is.
But can't we, I mean, can I claim that once you eradicate these miracles and these like otherworldly parts of the Bible or the Gospels, it's clear that what's left for us is only morality in the sense of self-training, not a social justice. I mean, I think there is a correlation between that. I mean, if in the understanding of justice as a kind of thing that, like, even otherworldly understanding of justice, as it's like in all Abrahamic religions, is somehow common. You see my point? I mean, like, don't you think that the reason that you believe that the book is simply about like the morality of the person and improvement of that, which I agree with you, like flourishing here, as far as I understand it, don't you think it is because that we have already, as atheists, like Christian atheists, Muslim atheists, we have eradicated these parts?
Yeah, but I don't think well, I'm not sure, because I don't think the parts that are eradicated are the bits which advocate for this social justice, right? The bits that are eradicated are just simply stories of miraculous occasions and the fulfilling of prophecy. So I don't think you're left with the sense of it being self-transformation rather than society transformation because we've taken out the miracles or everything. If anything, that'd be even more so, because if you have even more of the kind of supernatural and otherworldly things, you have even more emphasis on the unimportance of changing things in the here and now. And I think that's the key point, really.
Yeah, makes sense. I have a sentence that I found really beautiful from the book. It's like, if we turn away from this task of becoming who we ought to be, we in effect lose who we truly are. Just a kind of beautiful part of the book. I mean, like there are very interesting moments that I like. Also, they have this thing about metanoia. I don't know if I pronounced still well. You say that the paradox of metanoia is that it requires acute attention to oneself, but the result is that we become selfless. And it sort of makes sense that it's really different from the cherry picking, like, self-love books.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, these things sort of sound a bit paradoxical, but again, I think people be familiar with that kind of idea from other traditions as well. And my knowledge of Islam is very limited, but there are various different traits in Islam, and I'm sure there are sort of certain schools of thought in Islam which would emphasize that too. It seems to be, certain ideas recur time and again in different traditions independently. And when they do that, there's kind of something to it. And one of these ideas is that it is a slightly paradoxical thing, that you have to, to learn about yourself and pay attention to yourself. But in a way, you have to do that in order to overcome yourself. And I think that the reason it's not a paradox is that if without that kind of acute self-awareness and attention to how we act, in a way we're not properly free. We're just following our instincts and our whims, right? Now again, I think the one problem is that in the Western culture, the idea of freedom itself has become somewhat thin and shallow. And people think to be free is to be able to act on your desires and have what you want and do what you want. But pretty much every serious ethical and religious tradition in the world has said that that's not really a very valuable kind of freedom, because where do these wants come from? Who's making them? And these days as well, in the kind of economy we've got, our wants are often kind of being created by people who have an interest in us spending their money on them, right? So, if I just do what I want, what I'm often doing is I'm giving money to people who have worked very hard to make sure that I want what they're selling, right? That doesn't seem to be a great expression of freedom. It seems to be more an expression of the fact that I've become the slave of things. So, in order to become sort of free, and you have to know yourself well, but the consequence of that will tend to be, these traditions say, that you actually become less selfish, because you become, perhaps for many reasons. I mean, there are many different reasons for this, and I'm not quite sure that in Jesus we get enough information to really understand any kind of theoretical basis for this. But in the Buddhist tradition, for example, one reason for this is that you become to be aware more of the fact that there is no kind of stable, permanent self or ego there, that you're a kind of a collection of thoughts and feelings and sensations, which is kind of evolving over time. And therefore, if you give up the idea that there is this kind of core self there, one is naturally less concerned with it than if one assumes that there's a me in there and it's permanent and it needs to sort of survive and conquer, or whatever it might be. So I think that's the sort of general idea.
Very interesting. We already talked about parables and like the metaphorical language and so on and so forth. Like, because you're also a teacher, I have this question that, like, how about the opacity and the ambiguity in relation to the modern day demand, especially in education, like for being transparent? I repeat my concern again here, that there are plenty of things that one gains through the distance, like from, I mean, we are reading the text, the book, the Bible, from like centuries of distance, yeah. And but at the same time, I think that it's inevitable. There is this kind of opacity, there is kind of ambiguity, and at the same time, you go to at least in Germany, what I experience is that there is a very huge determination to be transparent in education. Yeah, like to convey the message as transparent as possible. And what do you think about it when it comes to education? Can we teach a book like that? Can we teach the Bible? Can we, does it make sense?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, there are different ways of understanding what you said, and I may not have the understanding in mind that you have. I mean, I think that generally speaking, certain forms of clarity are important, and I always strive to be as clear as possible. So I don't think there's any great virtue in being less clear than you have to be. But I do think that particularly with any subject where, this isn't just a strict matter of facts, where there's elements of interpretation or a sort of moral dimension, it is important, I think, that any kind of teaching shouldn't kind of present things as though this is the way it is, now go and do it, right? So in that sense, you have to have that kind of opacity, and you have to have you have to encourage people to do the thinking for themselves. And I think that's the key thing. Again, getting people to think for themselves is really important. And I mean, you say I'm a teacher. I mean, I've never been a full-time teacher, and I have to say that I don't really. Lots of people who teach say they enjoy teaching, and in some ways, I have enjoyed some teaching I've done, but I never enjoy that sense that I am the person with kind of the expertise to impart to people. That makes me nervous because I think I could be wrong. I might have misunderstood this, etc., etc. So I find the most if I'm ever sort of teaching, I mean, it's most satisfying, I think, if I can give people things to think about that are interesting perspectives, but that they are then doing a lot of the thinking for themselves. I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of saying this is how it is, particularly with philosophy. So yeah, so are the demands for teaching today to be sort of lack that kind of opacity? I mean, I can see that, and I know in schools, for example. So in philosophy, and we don't have much philosophy in schools in Britain. There was a philosophy A level, which is an examination people take at age 18. It's a pre-university examination, and there used to be an exam in that, not a very popular one. And it used to give people these very open-ended essays. And the problem was that it was kind of too open-ended for the purpose, because, the grades determine whether you go to university or not. And the marking of the grades was too erratic because it required too much on the different judgment of examiners. And so they changed it. And so now, it's much more transparent. If you can sort of, students know if they can tick off certain things, say certain things, they'll get tick, 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 mark, 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 and they get the grade. And I can see why that's done, and I can see why, but I think it's a big loss in that, because I mean, I don't want to be nostalgic. Education when I was younger wasn't always brilliant, but I think a lot of the typical examination was more open-ended, and it was more about your attempt to give a good answer, to grapple with things. It wasn't about information recall. And I think particularly with something like philosophy, you really don't want it to be just, what did X say? What did Y say? Tell me. You want people to think. So,
right, especially because you were talking about these skills, like the whole thing about these books is that they believe that transformation happens through skill. And I don't think that through this kind of dominant literalism that you convey the direct message and you have to get it across to the students. At least it's not Socratic. At least it's not the way. It doesn't irritate the person because it is like it's like direct. Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I found it interesting also that I mean, although you're trying to make it less and less extraterritorial and make it like this worldly, still the parables and metaphors are in the book, and they play their role as they were. There is a quotation from the book. There is some sentence from you that I quote: gradually my assumption that there was a God was replaced by an equally strong conviction that there wasn't. Now, having been a convinced but not dogmatic atheist for all my adult life, I'm sometimes surprised to be reminded of the seriousness of my religious youth, remembering how things that once seemed obvious to me now seem just as obviously absurd, in a good reminder not to be too quick to dismiss those whose views appear ridiculous, end of quote. Julian, here you talk about atheists, but not dogmatic atheists. Who are they?
Well, I hope that's most atheists. I think this is a really interesting issue because culturally, we had this sort of moment in the early 20th century of this new atheist movement, as it was called. And like a lot of these things, the label comes later. All it really meant was that, you know, Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion, and Sam Harris wrote his Letter to a Christian Nation, and Christopher Hitchens wrote his book, which I can't remember the name off the top of my head, and Daniel Dennett wrote, of all the four, I think the most sensible and interesting and balanced one, but they were all lumped together. And so there was this kind of moment where there were these very vocal atheists who got a big following, and they were kind of called the New Atheists. And, you know, and certainly in their tone and often in the content of what they said, they were, you know, they came across certainly as quite dogmatic. I say I would make Daniel Dennett as the exception to this. You know, that religion was just false, it was silly, it was ridiculous, we've got to overcome it, and it's kind of the source of all evil, whatever it might be. So what happened was, the unfortunate thing about that was that a lot of people who, you know, weren't really sure what atheists were, thought that's what atheists were all like. Atheism was basically very strongly anti-religious and very dogmatic. And I think that's historically true. I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, to be an atheist is not to have a belief in a god or gods. Simple as that. Now, there's nothing in that view which means you are therefore hate religion or you hate religious people. For a start, there are religious people who are probably technically atheist. I mean, there are, particularly in Christianity, you know, in the Church of England especially, it's not difficult to find priests who, when you ask them what God is to them, will say, well, God's not a person in the sky, and, you know, I don't think Jesus actually did rise from the dead, but they talk about these important they read it almost more as literature. Karen Armstrong is a very famous former nun who was writing, she ended up saying the same thing in many different ways, which was that the new atheists claim that religious truth is always about logos. In other words, it's about literal truth, whereas really religion is about mythos, it's about mythology. And that's not to say it's more serious than just stories, but, you know, it's just simply a mistake to think that it's advancing these kind of factual and historical claims. So there's a lot of variety on both sides. So a non-dogmatic atheist is someone who says, look, I'm not an agnostic, because to say I'm an agnostic would suggest that, you know, I don't know, does God exist or not? I don't know. Whereas actually an atheist is saying, yeah, I really don't think God exists. I mean, I can't see any reason to think that a God exists. It's possible, right? So you'd have to be 100% sure, but it's possible, but I don't take it, at the moment, I can't see it as being a serious possibility. You're not dogmatic because A, you accept the fact that you could be wrong. It's possible God exists, you haven't understood it properly. And you're also not dogmatic because you're not going around telling everyone who does believe in God that they must not believe in God and they're wrong and they're harmful and religion is terrible. Yeah, that seems to me a kind of atheism which is should be the mainstream atheism, and it probably is, to be honest. But I think the new atheism kind of created a temporary sort of idea that it wasn't like that. Maybe I'm describing atheism more as I would like it to be than it actually is. I mean, it is true that there always have been a lot of atheists who are quite kind of dogmatic, but I don't think that's necessarily true. Also, it becomes a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy, if you like, because if atheism in the culture is presenting itself in that way, then the only people who will identify as atheists will be the people who feel the same way. And there'll be other people who don't really believe in God, but they won't call themselves atheists because they think to be an atheist means being like that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Interesting. Julian, another sentence of the book that I found beautifully provocative is that you say there are people who are better than almost all others. To embrace the ethic of humility is not to pretend that none are better or worse than others. Humility in Jesus' teaching has nothing to do with what we today call self-esteem, end of quote. what do you mean with this difference? I mean, how can we distinguish humility in that book from the contemporary self-esteem?
Yeah, you got me there, because again, the problem I've got with this is I wrote this book several years ago, and I don't, and you read that very distinct passage, and I'm not entirely sure what I meant there. So I'll talk about humility and self-esteem.
Or let's talk about humility. I mean, what did you
Yeah.
understand of humility once you were writing this book? Yeah, I mean, especially because you are also at the same time emphasizing on the possibility of self-transformation. I mean, you should not stay poor if you're going to be Christian, even as an atheist, right? Yeah. I mean, so I think there is some humility that you want to make redundant in the book. Yeah, like you.
Well, I mean, humility is an I mean, I find humility an interesting concept. So I might just be talking about what I think about humility, and I'm not quite sure what I did or I didn't say in the book about it. And you know, Jesus, I think, does encourage humility. I think that's true. How humble he is himself is actually a little bit of a moot point, because, you know, he in some ways he seems to have a very high opinion of himself. But yeah, so what's the kind of humility he's talking about, and how does that relate to contemporary understandings? Well, I think the thing about the self-esteem point is that I think that, again, where there might be a little bit of a conflict between the kind of thing Jesus was saying and the current ideas of self-esteem, is that we think it's very important that people have self-esteem, and what we mean by that is often that people must have an affirming sort of set of attitudes towards themselves. So this reflects all sorts of things. So even with physical things. So we're encouraged to think that the healthy attitude is everyone should believe that they are beautiful, because everybody is beautiful, right? Everybody's beautiful, and that you should think you're beautiful, and no one should think they're not beautiful. It's kind of almost like an awful thing if someone thinks they're not beautiful. And I find this strange, right? Because I don't think people should be stigmatized for not conforming to a certain idea of beauty. I also think that sometimes norms of beauty are wrong and unhealthy. For example, when they suggest women should be thinner than is healthy, that's not natural and normal, etc., etc. So obviously there's a lot of wrong things going on about beauty, and a lot of things which should be challenged about that. But does that mean that the solution is that everyone must think I am beautiful? Well, I don't think so. I don't think I'm beautiful, right? Okay, I'm not. I'm okay with that. The point is that my sense of self-worth shouldn't depend upon myself thinking that I'm beautiful. Now, it's more important, though, when it comes to sort of moral character and ethical character. Now, it's not psychologically healthy to hate yourself and to see yourself as being awful and dreadful and worse than other people. But, you know, in the Christian tradition, there is a sense in which people are encouraged to think of themselves as being highly flawed and imperfect and in need of improvement. I think if you have the fully religious version of Christianity that I don't do in the book, the important point about that is that by accepting your own limitations and your imperfections, you have to open yourself up to the divine assistance or the divine grace that will enable you to overcome that. So in the religious version of Christianity, we accept the fact that we are so imperfect, we are so fallen, we are so depraved that we cannot save ourselves by our own effort. We have to accept divine help, which is also, of course, the system of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, you know, started as a Christian movement. You have to accept your powerlessness and accept a higher power in your life as part of their 12 steps, or how many steps it is. Now, I think that, you know, there's a sense in which I wouldn't agree exactly with the way that's kind of put, and I obviously don't think that we need divine assistance, but I think there is something actually important about us recognizing our own moral failings, and to think that no, we are not good enough. We are, so the self-esteem thing would say everyone's got to tell yourself, I'm good enough, I'm good enough, I'm etc., etc. And I think in a way it is a better practice to say I'm not good enough, not in a way that leads to self-loathing or self-hatred. You're not good enough partly because no one is. Okay, so in that sense, don't worry. No one's good enough. Maybe one or two people are, but the vast majority aren't. But you need to recognize you're not good enough, because that's the impetus to do more. There's a very interesting thing that stuck with me from many years ago, which is something from the philosopher Simon Critchley, who's not Christian, but very interested particularly in St. Paul. And in philosophy, contemporary Western philosophy, there's this maxim from Kant, derived from Kant, which is often sort of held up as a kind of a indubitable principle, which is that ought implies can. In other words, if I say you ought to do something, it's got to be true that you can do it. Otherwise, ought makes no sense. I can't say to you, you ought to cure cancer if you're unable to do it. That's a ridiculous thing to say. I can say you ought to visit your mother if you can visit your mother and she's nearby, right? I can't say you ought to visit your mother if you are in exile and you can't return to the country where your mother is, right? So ought implies can. That seems to be a sensible equation. And Critchley says that one of the challenges of Christian thought is he puts it in deliberately paradoxical term that ought implies cannot, right? And what he means is, it doesn't mean we should go around blaming people for not doing the things they can't do. But there's a sense in which if we don't demand more of ourselves than we can actually do, we're not pushing ourselves morally. And if we are serious about being better people, we have to push ourselves to be better than even we can be. So Jesus says, be thee perfect, be perfect. It's an impossible demand because we're not perfect. So why does he say be perfect? He's saying to us, always try to be better than you can be. And to do that requires humility, that we can't do that. So I think that, for me, one of the important things about humility is accepting the ways in which we're just not good enough, and that's the starting point for serious improvement, rather than fall for the idea that in order to have self-esteem we've got to tell ourselves we're good enough. I think that's just there are too many people who tell themselves they're good enough and they're fine and they're perfect and they're beautiful, and they could do with a little bit more humility to recognize they're not.
Very interesting, especially that you're talking about humility, and you just mentioned Simon Critchley. My background is mostly in humor and irony. So my question is that what's the role of humor in the kind of in the project that you have? I mean, well, I just leave it to you. I mean, what?
Well, I don't think it is much, unfortunately. I mean, Jesus wasn't very funny. There was a famous old comedy sketch, Rowan Atkinson, when he was a young comedian before Mr. Bean, did this sketch of a very trendy, fashionable vicar who says how important it is to laugh and everything, and he talked about Christ the comedian. But I mean, that's just ridiculous. There's nothing funny at all. And in fact, one of the problems with Jesus as a character, one of the interesting things again about moral instruction is that in the Western tradition, we've very much sort of focused on principles and theories, etc., etc. Whereas I think in a lot of traditions, we have the idea of the moral exemplar, that you learn by trying to emulate truly great people. And I think that in a sense, part of the way to read the Gospels is Jesus is meant to be some kind of exemplar for us to follow. And one problem with that is that there are some ways in which he's not a very attractive exemplar. Sure, people can talk about how he went to a wedding and he ate with tax collectors and things like that, but he's never someone who seems to be having fun or enjoying himself or making jokes. You imagine he'd be quite a hard work to be around, So I don't think humor and irony is something that you really find in the Gospels at all, unfortunately. We
Mm,
may be able to bring a bit of our own to it, but I don't think it's really there. Which is interesting because
absolutely.
that's not true. That's not true of all great moral teachers, of course. I think there's a certain amount of kind of irony and humor in, say, Confucius. In
Mm,
the Taoist text, there's lots of irony and humor there, and
yeah.
even David Hume's quite sort of funny. So it's not like it's impossible to do it. But Jesus is probably one of the most sort of straight-faced moral
Right. I
teachers
mean,
you can
I
imagine.
absolutely agree with you, Julian. But the question is that it does not mean that the atheists are funnier, right?
No. No, I agree. There aren't a lot of good jokes in the new atheist literature for sure. Well, again, that's part of the problem with the new atheism. It was so sort of like it was over
Somber,
serious in a
right?
way,
Yeah. Mm,
unable to laugh at itself.
mm,
Um, but again, that's not necessarily the case. I think that so okay, look, existentialism, right? So
mhm.
I sometimes make this point. So we think of the existentialists and we think of the French existentialists, Sartre and Camus and de Beauvoir, and it's all very serious. It's all gauloises and black clothes and anxiety and anguish and despair and all of that. It's all quite serious and fairly humorous, although I'm sure we could find a few jokes in there if we looked. But this is the idea, but Camus talks about the absurd. He talks about the absurdity of the human condition, without necessarily laughing about it. I think if you want to sort of understand that, if you want to sort of get a humorous and ironic version of an atheistic existentialism, what I say is Monty Python, in particular the films Life of Brian and Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Because what they're doing there is they're saying, look, we live in this godless universe where there's no ultimate meaning. Things don't ultimately make sense. And it is ridiculous and it is often cruel and it's actually often horrible. But what can we do? We can laugh at it. Laughing at it is one way that we get through it. And of course, the most famous scene of that in Life of Brian, which is considered absolutely heretical at the time, is that very famous scene at the end where they're on the cross dying and they're singing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life." Very dark, really. But that's a kind of the point. That's the way you get through the absurdity and meaninglessness of it. Whereas I think that the kind of atheists who sort of like talk about the absurdity and meaningless of life, and perhaps they don't appreciate the fact that this is quite rightly something that people might feel terrified by rather than liberated.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like at least like the Western history of philosophy is founded on irony. Socrates is a fear of irony. And a lot of his followers, right? Even in Kierkegaard, you have this irony, right? But still interesting that we have in most religions we have so like few figures of irony and humor, as you said, actually.
Well, okay, is
Um,
that because, I mean, you're the expert on this, so tell me. I mean, in the sense that to have irony and irony in that sense, you need to have some sense of a disconnection between our kind of pretensions and who we are, right? That's what allows a lot of the human. There's a gap between, what we want to be or what we think we are and what we
exactly,
actually are. But in
exactly.
most of the great sort of religious traditions, the point is that the key figures are what they're meant to be, and they're these prophets or these gods, whatever they might be. So there's no possibility of irony because
As you
these
said,
people
they're
are,
perfect figures, right? They're
yeah.
perfect exemplar. Yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
when there is
Yeah.
perfection, there is no irony, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or there is humor, right? Um, um, okay. Are you writing something now? I mean, what's your your recent project you're
Well, thank
writing
you very
now?
much for asking for that. I mean, I'm always writing because I'm a full-time writer. I mean, some people
Okay.
say you write a lot of books, and I say yes, but most people who write books are doing something else as well.
Mm,
And
mm,
I'm writing full time. That's how I earn my
oh,
living. So I'm always writing. I've had a book just come out, which I don't have at hand, which is called How to Think Like a Philosopher, which is, here it is. It's a very nice cover. I've been
cool.
very lucky to work with this cover designer who's excellent for the last sort of like 3 or 4 books. And
It's the same
James
publishing
Jones,
house, I guess, right?
This is Granta, yeah. James
This
Jones
is
is the.
also Granta,
I should
right.
mention yeah, people don't get enough credit for the things they do. Yes, and you can see the similarities in the design. He's brought a certain coherence to them. And that's a kind of the point about this book is that a lot of smart thinking books and philosophical thinking books are all about techniques and tools and cognitive hacks, and this book I try and focus on the fact that thinking well actually requires what you might call certain virtues and attitudes, sincerity and honesty, integrity. So that's a lot of the focus of that. That's only just come out, but the book I'm working on at the moment now is a book around food, and it's basically about the principles for a healthy and just food system,
Right.
and extracting those from the many different ways in which people have fed themselves across the world and across history. And are there some common principles there which we can learn as we try and construct a food system for a very changing world and a growing world? And that's what I'm working on for that. So very broad ranging. I mean, it's a lot. It might sound odd. People think philosopher writing about food, but it's a long-term interest. I've written, in fact, for some reason, I've got the book here. I wrote a book on philosophy and food a few years ago.
Cool.
Terrible.
Interesting.
And I've been involved with something called the Food Ethics Council.
Right.
So it's not a kind of a whim. It's quite a deep interest.
Right.
And that is fascinating. That is fascinating.
Interesting. So you're still writing that? Yeah. I hope I can read more of your books, and looking forward to read this book that you just mentioned. It just came out. That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Julian.